So hello everyone. So for today's discussion, I was assigned to discuss the chapter 15, which is the basic audit sampling concept. So natures and purpose of audit sampling is when we say sampling, it is a process whereby information is gained concerning the characteristics of population or universe or field of items by means of an examinations of only a portions of the items composing that the population or the sampling is therefore considered an inferential technique, and it allows an auditor to draw conclusions about transaction or account balances without sustaining the time and cost of examining all available data. So according to PSA 530 redrafted that the audit sampling is establishes standards provides guidance when the auditors has decided to use audit sampling and performing audit procedures. It deals with the auditor's use of statistical or non-statistical sampling when designing and selecting the audit sample, performing tests of controls and tests of details, and evaluating the result from the sample. And also, audit sampling defines as the applications of compliance or substantive procedures to less than 100% of the items within an account, balance, or class of transactions to enable the auditor to obtain and evaluate evidence of some characteristics of the balance or class and to form and assess and performing a conclusion concerning the characteristics. So why auditor samples or auditors use audit sampling when? First is the natures and materiality of the balance or class does not demand a 100% audit. The second one is a decision must be made about the balance or class. And last one is the time and cost to audit 100% of the population would be too great. So, testing procedures which do not involve sampling, testing procedures which do not involve sampling. First is test of controls on 100% of the items within population. So, for example, some audit plans, the audit of all or large accounts and of the portions of the small accounts and such situations. Only shall accounts would be subject to sampling, applying audit procedures to all items within an populations which have a particular characteristic does not qualify as audit sampling with respect to the portions of the population, examining nor regard to the populations as a whole, since the items were not selected on the total populations and a basis that was expected to be representative. So, such items might imply some characteristics of remaining portions of the populations, but would be necessarily be the basis of a valid conclusions about the remaining portions of the population. The second one is inquiry observation. So, procedures that depends on segregations of duties or that the otherwise provide no documentary evidence, tracing one or few transactions to obtain an understanding of an accounting systems and internal control. So, procedures performs to obtain an understanding of the internal control structures sufficient to plan an audit. So, do not involve sampling. So, however, many tests of controls used to assess controls risk to involve sampling. The next one is analytical procedures. So these involve the analysis of significant ratios and trends, including the resulting investigations of fluctuations and relationships that are inconsistent with other relevant information or deviate from the predicted amount. So sampling versus non-sampling risk. So in every audit engagement, a degree of risk is always present even when all transactions and balances are tested 100%. So this uncertainty is referred to as ultimate risk and is a combination of sampling and non-sampling risk. So when we say sampling risk, it is this refers to the risk that the auditor's conclusions based on a sample might be different from the conclusions they would reach if they examine every item and the entire population. So this is also the probability that a material's errors will occur during the accounting process. So this is also the probability that a material error will occur during the accounting process. So the two types of sampling risk are: first is the risk the auditor will conclude. So in this case, of the test controls that the control risk is lower than it actually is, or in the case of the substantive test that the material error does not exist when in fact it does. So this type of risk affects audit effectiveness and is more likely to lead to an inappropriate audit opinion. And the second one, types of sampling risk are the risks that auditor will conclude in the case of test of controls that the control risk is higher than it is actually is, or in the case of a substantive test that the material's error exceeds when in fact it does not. So this type naman of risk affects audit efficiency as it would usually lead to additional work to establish that initial conclusions and correct. Next one is the non-sampling risk. So when we say non-sampling risk, so this is refers also to the probability that a material error will not be discovered by the auditor, and the performance of the substantive test of non-sampling risk arises from the factors that cause the auditor to reach an erroneous conclusion for any reason that related to the size of the sample. So let's present statistical and statistical sampling. So non-statistical or judgment samplings procedures are designed and executed on the basis of the auditor's sound objective reasoning judgment. Although judgment sampling can involve arithmetic concept, subjective influence, and probabilities reasoning. So they are not formally derived from the mathematical sampling proofs and theorems. Finding from judgment sampling must always be interpreted subjectively and the professional judgments of the auditor. The next one we have statistical sampling. It's a mathematical derived tool which provides the auditors with an objective basis for expressing conclusions about populations characteristic based upon a sample of items from the population. So when we say statistical sampling, it means any approach to sampling that has the following characteristic. So first, we have random selections of a sample. And the second one is use of probability theory to evaluate sample results, including measurement of sampling risk. Now, let's proceed to the common variations of non-statistical sampling. So first, we have haphazard sampling. So when we say haphazard sampling, it consists of samplings units without any conscious bias, that is, without any special reason for including or omitting items from the sample. So for example, haphazard samples of vouchers contained in a file drawers might be selected by pulling vouchers from the drawer without regard for the voucher's size or locations of the drawer. The next one is block selection. So when we say block selections, it is consists of all items and a selected time periods, numerical sequence or alphabetical sequence. So let's say, for example, the auditor might examine all cash disbursement transactions in the first week of June or the last week of December. Due to the relatively large number of blocks needed to form a reasonable audit conclusion. Block sampling cannot generally be relied upon to efficiently produce to representative sample, and therefore it is not acceptable for statistical or non-statistical audit sampling. Next is judgmental sampling. So when we say judgmental sampling, so under this method, the auditor selects large or unusual items from the populations and uses some other judgmental criterions for selections. Obviously, this selections method has a conscious bias and cannot be considered a representative selections method. So as we can see here, this is the relationship between the non-statistical and statistical sampling. Next is attribute and variable sampling techniques. So, the auditor may use sampling procedures to measure both qualitative and quantitative characteristics of a population. So, attribute sampling technique. So, when we say attribute sampling technique, it is the attribute estimation procedures measures qualitative characteristic, while variables estimation procedures can measure quantitative characteristic. So, the auditor uses attribute estimation sampling when he or she is interested in measuring a qualitative features such as presence or absence of internal control procedures. When conducting tests of controls, the auditor must consider both the risk of over-reliance and the risk of under-reliance. So, the risk of over-reliance is the risk that the sample supports reliance on internal control when this reliance is unjustified. While the risk of under-reliance is the risk that the sample does not support reliance on internal control when the through compliance rate suggests that the auditor should rely on internal controls. If this is happens, so the result will be decreased efficiency and the forms of increased substantive testing procedures. So, the auditor can determine the upper precision's limit by considering first the sample size, the second one is the reliability, and the third one, the number of observed deviation. So, when we say the upper precision, it is limit is a rate or limit the rate of the occurrence which statistically exceeds the actual population error rate. So, the auditor then compares the upper probable error. So, to determine whether he or she can rely on internal controls related to the attribute examined. So, if the upper precision limit is less than the tolerable error, so the sample result suggests that the auditor should rely on the internal controls. So, controls examined. So, the next one is we have variables estimation sampling. So, when we say variables estimation sampling, it is used by the auditor during substantive testing. So, this provides an estimate of a pass-or range within which the rules audited value of the population lies. So, let's say for example, the auditor uses variables estimation sampling to determine whether the book value of an account balance is fairly stated. As in a sampling for attributes, variable estimation sampling exposes the auditor to two aspects of sampling risk. So first, we have the risk of incorrect rejections, and the second one is the risk of incorrect acceptance. So the risk of incorrect rejections or alpha, the risk that the sample supports the conclusions that the recorded account balance is materially misstated when is not materially misstated. And when we say the risk of incorrect acceptance naman or beta is the risk that the sample supports the conclusions that the recorded account balance is not materially misstated. So this is also referred to detection risk. Audit objectives. So when we say audit objectives, When deciding on audit samples, the auditor should consider the objectives of the test and the attributes of the populations which the sample will be drawn. So the auditor first considers the specific objectives to be achieved and combinations of audit procedures which is likely to best achieve those objectives. So it is considerations of the natures of the audit, evidence sought, and possible errors, conditions, or other characteristics relating to the audit evidence will assess the auditor or in defining what constitutes an errors and what population to use for sampling. We have also population. So it is important for the auditor to ensure that the population is first appropriate to the objective of the sampling procedures, and the second one is complete. So that's why it is important for the auditor to ensure that their population is appropriate to the objective of the sampling procedures, and also it is complete. Risk and assurance. So the auditors considers what conditions constitutes an error by reference to the objectives of the test. So a clear understanding of what constitutes an error is important to ensure that all and only those conditions that are relevant to the test objectives that are included in the projections of errors. So let's say, for example, in a substantive test procedures relating to the existence of accounts receivable, such as confirmation payments made by the customers before the confirmation date but received shortly after that date by the clients, are not considered an error. So also, misposting between customer accounts does not affect the total accounts receivables balance. So in planning the audit, so the auditors uses professional judgment to assess the level of audit risk that is appropriate. So this audit risk will it includes first the risk that materials errors will occur or inherent risk. The second one is the risk that our client systems of internal control will nor prevent or correct such errors, or when we say it is control risk, and the risk that any remaining material errors will not be detected by the auditor, or detection risk. So now let's move to tolerable error. So this is the maximum error and the populations that the auditor would be willing to accept and still conclude that the result from the sample has achieved its audit objective. So there is an inverse relationship between the tolerable error and the required sample size. The tolerable error, the larger sample size the auditor will required. Now let's proceed to expected error in the population. So the expected error in the population when performing test of control, the auditor generally makes a preliminary assessment of the rate of errors the auditor expect to find and the populations to be tested and the level of control risk. So this assessment is based on the auditor's prior knowledge or the examinations of the small number of items from the population. So we have also the factors to be considered in the determining the expected error in the population. First is error levels and identified in previous audits. We have also the second one, changes in the client procedures, and the third one, evidence available from his evaluations of the systems of the internal control and from results of analytical review procedures. So, stratification. So, stratification is the process of dividing a population into subpopulations. That is a group of sampling units which have similar characteristics, often monetary value. So, the reductions of variability within each stratum results in a smaller overall sample size. Then one of the random selections methods is used to select sample item from each stratum. So stratification enables the auditor to direct his efforts towards the items he considers would potentially contain the greater monetary error. Let's say 20% of the items in the population may make up 90% of the value of an account balance. So the auditors may decide to examine a sample of this item. So the auditor evaluates the result of this sample and reaches a conclusions on the 90% of value separately from the remaining 10%, or when we say on which a further sample or other means of gathering evidence will be used or which may be considered immaterial. Next is we have value-weighted selections. So when we say value-weighted selections, it will often be efficient and substantive testing, particularly when testing for overstatements. To identify the sampling unit as the individual monetary units or peso that makes or that make on the account's balance or class of transactions. So having selected specific monetary units within the population, for example, the accounts receivable balance, which is the auditor then examined, say for example, individual balances that contain those monetary units. So this approach to defining the sampling unit ensures that unit effort is directed to the larger value items because they have a greater chance of selections and can result in smaller sample size. Okay, now for selecting the samples, the auditor should select items for the sample with the expectation sampling units in the populations have a chance of selection. So the statistical sampling requires that the sample items are selected at random so that each sampling unit has a known chance of being selected. So the sampling units might be physical items such as invoices or monetary units. In statistical sampling naman, an auditor uses professional judgment to select the items because the purpose of sampling is to draw conclusions about the entire population. So the auditor, by choosing sample items which have characteristic of the populations and the sample needs to be selected so that bias is avoided. Okay, for the sample selection methods. So first we have random sampling. So when it's a random sampling, it is a simple random sample. Is a sample that is selected in such a way that every item in the population has an equal chance of being selected. So this is accomplished by using a printed table of random numbers or computer software that generates random numbers. The second one is the systematic sampling. Okay, so when we say systematic sampling, in using these methods, the auditor counts through the populations and selects item on the basis of a sampling interval, which is determined by dividing the number of physical items in the population by sample size. So the interval may also be based on a certain number of items, like every 29 vouchers number, or on monetary totals of every 1,500 and the cumulative value of the population. The third one is stratified random sampling. So, as previously explained naman, when a population is highly variable, sampling without stratification requires very large sample size. To stratify the auditors groups, so the populations or strata that are similar is an amount. So, sample are then drawn from each stratum using one of the random selection. The fourth one, the sampling with probability proportional to size. So, this method of sampling emphasizes larger peso items within an account balance. So, the probability of an item being selected in this method is directly proportional peso amount. So, let's say for example, a 10,000 item has twice the chance being selected as 5,000 item and 10 times. So, the chance of 1,000 items, so the chance is of a 1,000 item. So each individual peso and the account balance has an equal balance of selection, but each physical unit does not. So here is the examples of the factors influencing sample size for test control. So first is an increase, right? So an increase and the extent to which the auditor's risk assessment takes into account relevance. So, ang effect ana sa sample size kay mag-increase. So, the more assurance the auditors intends to obtain from the operating effectiveness of controls, the lower the auditor assessments of the risk of materials misstatement will be, and the larger the sample size will not to be, when the auditor's assessments of the risk of materials misstatements at the assertions level includes an exceptions of the operating effectiveness of controls. So the auditor is required to perform tests of controls. Greater the reliance, the effectiveness of controls in the risk assessment. So the greater is the extent of the auditor's test of controls, and therefore the sample size is increased. So the next one, factors influencing the sample size for test of control is an increase in the tolerable rate of deviation. So, mag-decrease siya sa effect on sample size. Why? This is because the lower the tolerable rate of deviation, the larger the sample size needs to be. That's why. Next, we have an increase in the auditor's desired levels of assurance that the tolerable rates of deviation is not exceed by the actual rate of deviations in population. So, mag-increase ang iyahang effect on sample size. So, why siya mag-increase? Because the greater the level of the assurance that the auditor desires that the results of the samples are in fact indicative of the actual incidence of the deviations in the population. So the larger the sample size needs to be. And the last one is an increase in the number of sampling units in the population. So ang effect also ana sa sample size kay negligible effect. So why no? Kay for large population, the actual size of the population has little, if any, effect on the sample size. For small population, however, the audit sampling may not be as efficient as alternative means of obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence. So now, for examples of factors influencing sample size for test of details. So katong first na atong gidiscuss, kay mo to siya ang factors influencing sample size for test of control, and now for test of details. So first, an increase in the auditor's assessment of the risk of the material misstatement. So, the effect on sample size kay mag-increase. So, why it increase? Because the higher the auditor assessments of the risk of material misstatement on the larger sample size needs to be. So, the auditor assessment of the risk of the material inherent risk of control. So, for example, if the auditor does not perform tests of control, the auditor's risk assessment cannot be reduced for the effective operations of the internal control, with respect to the particular assertion. So, therefore, in order to reduce audit risk and will rely more on substantive procedures, the more audit evidence that is obtained from tests of controls, that is the lower and detection risk. The larger the sample size will need to be. Next one, we have an increase in the use of other substantive procedures directed at the same assertion. So, ang effect po niya sa effect on sample size kay mag-decrease. Why? Because the more the auditor is relying on other substantive procedures or test of details or substantive analytical procedures to reduce to an acceptable level the detection risk regarding a particular population, the less assurance the auditor will require from the sampling, and therefore the smaller the sample size. The third one, we have an increase in the auditor's desired level of the assurance that tolerable misstatement is not exceeded by actual misstatements in the population. So, mag-increase siya. So, why? Because the greater the level of assurance that the auditor requires that the results of the samples are in fact indicative of the actual amount of misstatement and the population. So, the larger the sample size needs to be. The fourth one is an increase in tolerable misstatement. So, it is, ang effect ana niya sa sample size kay decrease. Why? It is because the lower the tolerable misstatement, the larger the sample size need to be. So, what increase in the amount of misstatement of the auditors expect to find in the population. So, yung effect nito sa sample size kay mag-increase siya. Nga naman, kay the greater the amount of the misstatement of the auditor expect to find in the population. So, the larger the sample size needs to be in the order to make a reasonable estimate of the actual amount of the misstatements in the population. So, the factors relevant to the auditor's considerations of the expected misstatements amount include the extent to which item values are determined subjectively. So the results of tests of controls, which is the results of the audit procedures. So it applies in the prior periods and the results of the other substantive procedures. The next one, we have the certifications of the populations when appropriate. So mag-decrease siya. Why? Because when there is a wide range variability in the monetary size of items and the population, it may be useful to stratify the population. When a populations can be appropriately stratified, the aggregate of the sample size from the strata or the certification generally will be less than the sample size that would have been required to attain a given level of sampling risk had one sample been drawn from the whole population. The last one, we have the number of the sampling units in the population is neglected or negligible effect. So, why siya? Negligible effect siya sa effect on sample size. Because for large population, the actual size of the population has little, if any, effect on a sample size. So, thus, for small populations, audit sampling is often not as efficient as alternative means of obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence. So, however, when using monetary unit sampling and increase in the monetary value of the population, it increase in materially for the financial statements as a whole. And also, it is applicable to materiality level or levels for the particular classes of transaction. So, the accounts balances or disclosure. And now, we have here the evaluations of sample results. So, having carried out in each sample items, those audit procedures that are appropriate to the particular audit objective. So, the auditor should first, we have analyzed any error detected in the sample. The second one is project the errors found and the sample to the population. And the last one is to assess the sampling risk. This one is the detailed audit sampling plan. So definition and descriptions of the audit sampling plans. So first, we have attribute sampling plan. So this is used to test an entity's rate of deviations or also called rate of the occurrence from a prescribed control procedure. So it is an audit sampling in which auditors look for the presence or absence of a control conditions. The second one is the variable sampling plan. So this is used to test whether recorded account balances are fairly stated. So let's say, for example, an auditors might use a variable sampling plan to test recorded peso amounts for receivables, inventory, fixed asset additions, among others. The third one is statistical sampling plan. So when we say statistical sampling plan, this is a sampling technique in which an auditor uses the laws of the probability to select and evaluate a sample. So when using statistical sampling, auditors must select a random sample. So which means every items in the populations must have an equal chance of being included in the sample. So the fourth one, we have the non-statistical sampling plan. So these plans rely exclusively on the subjective judgments to determine sample size and to evaluate sample results. The regular are classical attributes sampling. So ito naman is the sampling plan. Enables the auditors to estimate the rate of occurrence of certain characteristics in the population. So let's say, for example, the auditors might use this plan. So the estimate of the percentage of cash disbursement processed during the years that were not approved. So di siya ma-approve. And now let's proceed to the mean per unit estimation. So when we say mean per unit estimations, this is a classical variable sampling plan. Enables the auditors to estimate the average peso value or other variables. So of the items in the populations, determining the average value of items in a sample. The next ones, we have the difference estimation. So when we say difference estimation, this is a sampling plan that uses the difference between the audited or correct ba siya? Correct values in book values of the items in the sample to calculate the estimated total audited value of the population. So the difference estimation is used in lieu of ratios estimations when the difference are not nearly proportional or proportional to book value. Next one is the ratio estimation. So this is sampling plan that uses the ratio of audited or correct pod ba siya? So no, values to book values of items in the sample to calculate the estimation total audited value of the population. So the ratio estimation is used in lieu of difference estimations when the differences are nearly proportional to book values. So when you say regression, it is approach in a similar to the difference in ratio approach. So this approach has the effect of using both the average ratio and the average difference in the calculating an estimate of the total amount for the population. And of course, we have discovery sampling. So these forms of attribute sampling is designed to locate at least one deviations or exception in the population. So when you say discovery sampling is often used in situations in which the auditors expect a very low rate of occurrence of some critical deviation. So the purpose of discovery sample is to detect at least one deviation with a predetermined risk of assessing control risk too low. So if the deviation rate is the population is greater than the specified tolerable deviation rate. The next one is the sequential or stop or go sampling. So this is a sampling plan for which the sample is selected in several steps with the need to perform each step conditionals on the results of the previous step. So this is the results may either be so poor as to indicate that the control may not be relied upon or so good as to justify reliance as each step. We have also probability proportional to size or PPS. So this technique also is referred to a peso unit sampling. So it applies attribute sampling theory to develop an estimate of the total peso amount of misstatement in the population. Probability or proportionally to size sampling is used an alternative to classical variable sample methods for performing substantive tests of transaction or the balances. We have also the classical variable sampling models. So these use normal distribution theory to evaluate selected characteristics of populations on the basis of a sample of the items constituting the population. So this sampling application provide the auditors with an estimate of a numerical quantity such as the peso balances of an account. So this technique is primarily used by the auditor perform or substantive tests. Now for the statistical sampling naman, so selecting items for testing to gather audit evidence. So when designing audit procedures, yung auditor kay dapat nila ma-determine selecting item for testing. So the means of available to the auditor are, first, we have selecting all items, which is 100% examination. And letter B, specific or selecting specific items, and audit sampling. So whether auditors use statistical sampling or non-statistical sampling methods, auditor must decide on, first, selecting all item, which is 100% examinations, selecting specific items, and which sampling techniques is used. So for design of the sample, so here are the factors that the auditor should consider in designing an audit sample. So we have audit objectives, population and its characteristic, risk and assurance, tolerable error, expected errors in the population, and stratification. Okay, so I think that's all. So that's all in behalf of my report. I hope that you learned something. So thank you very much for listening.